Hi everyone, my name is Melissa and I am a Year 13 history prefect at Newstead. I study history, classical civilization and economics, and we're here, us history prefects are here to talk about why you should study history as an A-level. So more specifically, we're going to be talking about why we enjoy history. We're going to talk you through a normal lesson at Newstead. Also, we're going to be discussing the jump from GCSE to A-level history, and also just provide you with some general tips that we have from our experience. So I'm going to be talking about why we enjoy history. So firstly, the content itself, the history content itself is just generally interesting. So we study two very different time periods. So the Stuart period, which is 17th century, and the USSR, which is communism in the USSR, and the satellite states, which is 20th century. So the Stuart period particularly was very unique compared to any other historical eras in that it involved the first regicide in English history. So this was the beheading of Charles I. And also we look at the subsequent changes in leadership, particularly by Oliver Cromwell. On the 20th century side of the course, we look at, as I said before, the USSR and most of its satellite states. So these include Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Romania and Bulgaria. And what's particularly interesting about learning about these is, looking at the interactions between the different countries and how, all the satellite states were expected to look to the USSR as the father of Soviet-style communism, look to them for guidance. But as you will discover, this often was not the case. Also, another point of interest about history is, the independent reading that we do. It forms a large part of your study of history here at Newstead. And, often the reading is very interesting and gives us allows us to gain a better understanding of the topics that we're looking at. Thirdly, the teaching is incredibly supportive. So here at A-level we have two history teachers, Miss Smith and Miss Young, and they're amazing at giving you support in whatever kind of history-based issues that you have. So whether that's maybe you're finding a concept quite difficult to grasp, and they're always happy to give guidance with that, or you want to give an extra essay or go through an essay that you think you didn't do particularly well on, they're always willing to put in the time and go through and support you with that. So the support is amazing. And lastly, just to note, some people argue that history isn't relevant anymore, but actually if you think about it, learning about the past helps us to gain a better understanding of, the world today and the issues that exist. And because we study history, we can examine these issues from a different perspective. So, for example, the Stuart era, as I said before, was particularly turbulent in terms of political stability and, consensus within Parliament between MPs. And, this, if you think about it, this links to the current divisions in Parliament caused by Brexit, with issues around protectionism and nationalism. So it is actually very relevant to the world around us. So people who take history as an A-level often go on to some of the best universities in the world. So this includes Oxford and Cambridge, and of course the Russell Group universities. And last year, there were many students who did hit history A-level that accepted offers from, both Oxford and Cambridge, and also other leading universities. So we'd recommend history because it is a great stepping stone between A-levels and a degree. So universities particularly like it because it expands on skills such as critical thinking and analysis, and really just, your basic skills of presenting a coherent argument, which are vital to, any university degree that you undertake. So for example, obviously I take history, but I've applied for law, and people in my year are applying for subjects such as PPE, which, although don't directly involve history within the degree, they use a lot of the same skills, which are highly valued. In terms of trips, so a trip is ran every year to an Eastern European country, and although this year's though cancelled, was going to be to Gdansk in Poland, and this was to support our studies of the USSR and communism in the satellite states.
It's made out of two main modules which make up 80% of our course, and this is Stuart's, so the Crisis of Monarchy from 1603 to 1702, and then also Crisis of Communism, the USSR and the Soviet Empire, and that ranges from 1953 to 2000. The other 20% of it is made up of our NEA coursework, so our non-exam assessment, and this is on Tudor rebellions. And now a bit about each one in more depth. The Stuart's module is a fascinating course where we investigate finance, political and religious radicalism, and in particular changing relationship between Crown and Parliament. In Year 12, starting in 1603, we look at King James I of England, who was also James VI of Scotland, being the first to combine the two thrones, and we also learn about Buckingham, the whole scandal of favourites, and especially contrasting James and Charles I, and explore the challenges that there are to the absolutist monarchy. The civil wars, and then all the way up to January 1649, where it's a pivotal moment of English history, so the execution of Charles I and the first ever regicide. And then for Year 13, we continue from this. We look at the repercussions of this, the consequences, the complete uncertainty and instability following that, the consolidation of the Republic, and learning about Scotland as well, as the siege of Drogheda and Wexford in Ireland, so history of England specifically. We also look at Ireland and Scotland. And then we also look at the Rump Parliament and then focus on the Commonwealth and Cromwell as Lord Protector, and also commonly known as King in all but name. So we look at the repercussions of a time for England without a king and how everyone manages and why they would even accept Cromwell in the first place. It's especially interesting looking into his own beginnings and how this impacts his policies and whether he always wanted to be king in the first place. And then we also look at, from there, leading on to the restored monarchy, so when Charles II takes the throne, and then constitutional monarchy, and James II, the Glorious Revolution, and ending with William III and Mary, who were actually crowned joint monarchs of England, and then Scotland and Ireland 1689, which marks an important transition towards parliamentary rule that we recognise and still know today, finally finishing our course in 1702. And then on the other hand, in the USSR modules, we investigate the crisis of communism in practice and its demise. So particularly interesting in that we can still see the legacy it has in Putin's Russia today, and it ends up giving us a better understanding of the issues Eastern Europe because of the impact of communism in the early 20th century and late 20th century. In Year 12, we focus on the crisis in the Soviet Union. So we start in 1953, which is the death of Stalin, and we look at the power struggle, so which leader should come next, and then we look at Stalinization, de-Stalinization, the Stalinist legacy, and namely the lasting terror that it brought. And then each of the following leaders, starting from Khrushchev, so it might seem really complicated having to tackle all the leaders up to Putin of today, but what's really interesting is that you can find the parts that really make them stand out. For example, Khrushchev, I always think of the shoe bang incident at the United Nations General Assembly, because you really can't forget a Russian leader just banging his shoe during that. It's completely ridiculous, but it's those things that you really remember and actually help you understand the personality and therefore what influenced their political and economical reforms or attempted reforms. We also look at the style of leadership, the personality and reforms in general, for example the 5-year plans, and also how party organisation changed over this period and their international relations, especially with the West. Afterwards, we enter Brezhnev's stagnation era, with the Cold War still prominent, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and we explore the political dissidents and protests, followed by Andropov, Chenenko, and then Gorbachev. So we widely regard him as the reformer, and this also makes us challenge our preconceived conceptions and assumptions, because he wasn't actually a reformer right from the start. He didn't intend to completely change so radically as we always think the USSR. He was actually quite initially more conservative, and we learn what actually caused him to become more of a reformer. And then we significantly look at the collapse of the USSR, then Yeltsin and Putin as the leader, and the state of Russia politically, economically and socially by 2000. After that, in Year 13, we focus on the crisis of the Soviet Empire in general, so this refers to satellite states and the repression. So once again, it may seem challenging to look at all of them and remember all of this, but by making timelines, finding common factors for Poland, East Germany and other states, satellite states, it makes it a lot easier, and it's precisely the fact that we explore these different countries and how they took to communism or how they rejected it or tried to resist it that makes the course really fascinating for me, especially. In particular, looking at the impact of the collapse of communism and the repercussions this had and the newly nationalist states, and also the consolidation of government and the political, economic and social progress, which once again we can still see the lasting impacts today. So it's a really relevant piece of history that we can also relate to. And then the other aspects, as we mentioned before, was the NEA coursework. So this is familiar to any DT or art GCSE students, and it's completed in year 13. This is a 3,500 words to 4,500 words essay known as the historical investigation, where you pick a question wherever your interests lie, and it's also all under the umbrella topic of the Tudor rebellions. So again, it might seem really daunting, but we get loads of advice about how to structure it, how to evaluate sources and interpretations, and it all builds up skills we already learnt in the Stewart and USSR modules and GCSE as well. So how lessons work is in year 12 we have 4 lessons a week, 2 for each module, and we have different teachers for each. So Mrs. Smith teaches USSR and Miss Young teaches Stewart's. In year 13 this may become 5 lessons a week, with the 5th lesson being the NEA lesson. And we also learn loads of context for that, so it's not just, go write your historical investigation and your essay, it's learning about the background first and then being encouraged to look at several books and end up writing your own piece of work at the end. And then how lessons usually work is we go over the content, so this is much more than just reading from a textbook. It has included so far, quite memorably, acting out Cromwell's dissolution of the Rump Parliament, telling them to basically stop, you're not working, and then making timelines, regular quizzes to make sure key dates stay in our memory, or group activities as well, cross-referencing other texts. So we're also recommended to do our own wider reading, and it's also at your pleasure, you're not forced to, but it really helps you, and it explores the time period through podcasts, or it could be lectures. I recommend Lucy Worsley's podcasts, which are normally on BBC iPlayer, and she covers loads of it, and also dresses up, which makes it more atmospheric as well, and also through films and books. What's especially good about history, especially at Newstead, is the teaching approach. So rather than going straight into expecting us to tackle the full assessment essay at once, we learn the skills first. For example, we assess one extract or source and learn the key skills to do that, and this means that we get to refine our skills over a period of time and about the method of evaluating it, and rather than getting really overwhelmed at having to tackle a whole essay, as I know having to do that right from the start, I would really panic. And then when we gradually move on to doing the full essay, so 3 extracts or 3 sources, we'd have mastered it, and it's quite satisfying being able to write the full thing and getting good grades for that, as opposed to going straight on and not doing so well in that and not knowing where we've gone wrong. Same for open questions, so we learn to structure them, we plan them together in class, and then we write about one factor perhaps before doing the whole essay towards the end of the year or the middle of the year. And for homework, it ranges from listening to interesting podcasts to help our wider understanding, or it could also just be general things to supplement our knowledge, so it could be just recommending books, or it could just be writing up part of an essay or the entirety of one, and then this gets assessed and we get grade for that. And this can also include getting model answers as well, so we know what we should aim for or follow, or examples of different styles of writing as well. So moving on to the jump from GCSE to A-level, the key differences are probably the exam style and structure. So unlike GCSE, where it could be assessing interpretation or answering 5, 10 or 25 marker questions, how this works is although there's less overall questions, it's also in a lot more depth and detail. So for A-level especially, it's a lot less formulaic, so it's not, okay, this is the structure you're meant to follow, you have to do this in this way. So while we do get a general structure, so the classic introduction, conclusion, paragraphs in between, or ways of evaluating sources, it's a lot more developing your own critical style and your critical voice, justified by your reading, what you've learned in class, and building upon your GCSE skills. For example, in the sources questions I mentioned earlier, and also for the extract questions. And then, especially for sources, we keep on what we did at GCSE, looking into PACT, so this stands for provenance, argument, content and tone. And similarly for the open questions, with all the questions regarding more developed answers, so it's not just, oh, this happened, which therefore supports my point of this. It's going into why does it support it, and how can we explain this further, and maybe make links across several time periods, or the relevance of it still has today. And then you also, probably the key part is that the style of question as I mentioned earlier. So for USSR, we do extract questions. So we assess how valuable this extract is to a historian studying a particular area. So we divide it up into the sections of packed, and the other section of USSR is an open statement. So we evaluate how valid a view is. So this would be, again, basing up of our knowledge. So it's really key to know our statistics well, our dates, which fully justify it, as opposed to saying, oh, an act happened in 1698. We need a precise what act it was and what the impact of it was. And likewise for Stewart's, what we do is sources questions. So we assess how convincing something is, how unconvincing it is. So even if the question is assess how convincing the source is, what we need to do is have some paragraphs assessing how convincing it is, and then also look on the flip side. However, it's worth noting that, and also assessing how unconvincing it is to make a reasonable and justified argument at the end. And then for the open questions, just like USSR, we have a statement, but this time we're answering questions in the style of explaining why you disagree or agree with this view. Lastly, having the NEA tool is quite new for most of us. So it's, as I said, historical investigation, and again, you apply all the skills, so all the skills you had from GCSE, look at interpretation in particular, so orthodox views, counter-revisionist views, and also perhaps what's quite clearly different is you investigate the historian itself. So you look at maybe old interviews with the historian, what they've further researched into, have certain of their books contradicted each other. So you're really investigating into history itself as a broad topic, as opposed to just a certain time period. So you're exploring the historian as a person, and also exploring the historical context and the historical characters that you might be exploring for the rebellions. And another good thing about it is that you have 20% of the A-level all done before actually sitting the exam, so it's also quite reassuring, especially if you struggle a lot more in time conditions. Another thing that is quite different is the teaching approach and independent study. So while GCSE, as I said, is really textbook based, for A-level, it's having other materials are used to enhance our knowledge of a topic. So this could be archives from satellite states, for example, for the second Year 13 part, Crisis in the Soviet Empire, or extracts from books, perhaps on a certain reform or the repercussion of, let's say, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the impact it had on civilians. And our teachers often give suggestions too. So what's also really striking is that Miss Smith and Miss Young, they really enjoy and really know their subjects really well, so they can point us into whatever our interests lie within the subject, even if it's beyond the specification, because it's not just about, oh, let's get an A-star in history, let's get an A in history. It's about doing what you enjoy in history and really enjoying the course. I think that's what makes Newstead studying history really distinct from anywhere else. I think even if you had a really, you wanted to discover even before the period of actually study, so maybe in the Trotsky, Miss Smith will be really happy to give you guidance on where you could go into reading that. And that also contributes why we have such good destinations later on for history at university, and why so many people take history at Newstead. And then, for example, myself, I'm really interested in the lives of ordinary people in the Stuart period, which we don't really cover in the course, which is more on the politics, political nation, the government. So I'm reading The English Civil War, A People's History by Diane Purkis, which therefore gives me a better overall picture of the period and provides me with a more nuanced argument when discussing the impacts of political religious changes.
While managing workload does become more difficult at A-levels compared to GCSEs, it's completely manageable if you try and stay on top of it from the beginning of Year 12. However, wider reading is much more important to A-levels than GCSEs, so it's really important to make time to read relevant books and relate them back to your course. This is not just specific to history A-level, but with any subject, as you need to understand your topics in depth and be able to relate them back to information that you've learnt through wider reading. I would recommend trying to do at least 2 hours per week at the beginning of Year 12, as it really sets you up to do well for the rest of the year. Obviously, another thing that's different from history, GCSE to A-level is the style of essay that you get, and how often you get set these essays in class. Contrary to the scary myths you hear from sixth form students, essay workloads are not bad at all. At the beginning of the year, you learn the layout of your essays, and then you begin by writing one paragraph and correcting them. This way you build up to writing a full essay, so you don't feel out of your depth. Another way to manage your workload once you do get set an essay is to try and plan it immediately. If you don't have the time to write it all immediately, then that's not a problem. But if you write down your plan very soon after you talk about it in the lesson, then it's at the forefront of your mind and much easier to do sooner rather than later. Then, even if you can't write the essay immediately, you've at least got that to work from. Learning and memorising the content itself is not so different from GCSEs. For example, flashcards are still really great to use, where you write down key information or key dates and then get a parent or friend to quiz you. Mind maps are also great in order to get a larger period of time down all in one place, or you can use timelines so that you can compare knowledge from the start of the course as opposed to the latter half of the course. If you prefer revising online, there's a really good app called Anki, where you can make flashcards. This is also good if you're not particularly organised and know that you lose things a lot. Similarly, there's Quizlet, which I'm sure a lot of you use for GCSEs at the moment. One really important thing to remember when it comes to workload is to communicate with your teachers. If you're struggling, do not be afraid to ask for help. You can ask for help from your classmates if you don't understand something. You can ask for help from students in the year above, because the chances are that they've been in the exact same place as you at one point or another. Above all, ask for help from your teachers. If you're really struggling with the content, ask them for some advice. Or if you don't know why you haven't done very well in an essay, ask them for how to improve. Nothing is ever as bad as it seems, so don't panic and remember that it's a marathon, not a sprint. But most importantly, have fun. The history course is very interesting, the lessons are interactive, and when you do read outside of the lessons, it doesn't feel like a chore. So good luck, and I hope you choose this subject.